Now, if you haven't yet bought your latest edition of Forbes Africa, this is why you should. Forbes Africa Managing Editor Chris Bishop joins me now to tell us what's inside the magazine so that we can go out and buy it.
Okay. Well, on the cover of the magazine, it's another multimillionaire, as usual, Narendra Ravu from Nairobi in Kenya. Remarkable story, a man who was sent to Nairobi from India, the age of 16, to be a priest, believe it or not. And anyway, when he was about 18, his father instructed him to get married. And he married a young lady, then decided to go into the steel business with a small little shop which he rented for about $70 a month. He said his wife used to look after the shop and he used to go and do the deliveries. And then they went into manufacturing of steel. Now, this is one thing we have at Forbes, is that there's always that bit of luck and that chance that makes a fortune of something like this, 400 million. They were struggling. They were making steel. There was a big price war going on. They were being cut out in the market. Then in 1992, the steel price rocketed, as you probably know, and they had $1.2 million worth of steel sitting in their warehouse ready to go. And he sold it. He made $1 million overnight, and that's what made his name.
Phenomenal
And then
story.
he went into cement. He made a fortune. He's got cement factories there. I mean, he's one of the few people in this continent to say no to Aliko Dangote, who wanted to buy him out of his cement factory. The man with nerves of steel.
Nerves of steel, quite clearly. It's just a pity because it seems as though a lot of Africans need that across the board, especially when we take a look at what happened with the Al-Shabaab attacks and xenophobic attacks.
I know. Well, we've got a couple of
continent.
unsettling stories in this issue. We've got the Al-Shabaab attacks in the northeast of Kenya. We've got on-the-ground reports and analysis. And the quote we used for our headline was, if it was our day to die, we would rather die outside. That was a quote from one of the students. They were hiding inside the university in a wardrobe. And the one student said to the other, like, if we're going to die, let's die outside. Let's not die in here. It's very sad. But unfortunately, we have to carry these stories about xenophobia as well in South Africa. We feel that we don't just tell, you know, everything's
The good story.
rosy in the garden stories. No, we have to tell the whole story, the ugly side of what's happening in the continent as well. And I think these are important stories that should be told.
On the level of the coverage, and I want to go back to the Al-Shabaab one very briefly, it almost seems as though it's been, you know, international media hasn't paid too much attention to it.
Well, this is one of the points I made in my column, but also in the story, and the fact that if you think about it, if one student was shot dead at Harvard University or Oxford University, it would still be on the news now. People would still be talking about it now. They'd be talking about security, they'd be talking about the families, they'd be talking about memorial services. Terrible shooting like this, where scores of young, bright African students were killed, and then it just disappears off the news in a few days. And I think it's a disgrace, actually. And I think that it's one of those great, you know, the telescope the wrong way around when it comes to this continent. And that's another reason why we cover these stories. We think they're important. They're happening to African people, and they're important.
And that's why Africans need to tell their own stories through Forbes magazine.
Well, exactly what we've got.
That brings us to exactly one of the most exciting stories you have, World War II, a KZN gentleman who was involved in this war.
It's a remarkable story, actually. We were 70 years on May the 8th this week since the end of World War II. Now, millions of Africans fought all over the world in World War II. We've got a story in here talking about how it was a great add of pace to the calls for nationalism post-war. I mean, most countries were independent in the 20, 30 years after World War II, because people came back from the war, they decided they wanted freedom and independence. Quite fair enough. But we got one of the last survivors of the glider assault in Normandy in 1944, a man called Alex Reith. There's very few of them left. He'll be 93 on May the 14th. And he lives in Margate in KwaZulu-Natal.
Wow.
And there was a great layout here by our layout artist, our art director.
It's
in fact, the journalist just phoned me up and said, thank you very much, that's a fantastic layout. It's not very often you get that from somebody. And this is the guy who flew through hell twice. He was on Normandy, also he was on A Bridge Too Far. You might remember the film, but when they tried to cut the Germans off in Holland, and he survived terrible odds, and he's still alive. And the south coast of KwaZulu-Natal on the beach. So it's an amazing story.
Fantastic. All the more reason why we need to go get out our May issue of the Forbes magazine. Thank you so much to Forbes.
Thank you very much
Chris
indeed.
Bishop, rather. I nearly called you Forbes Bishop. Clearly a name change there.
You can.
Chris Bishop there, the managing editor of Forbes Africa magazine.